Howdy folks, Rain of Galen here, and welcome to another episode of Rain Makes Stuff, where I make life-size replicas and not-so-life-size statues of the things you see in video games. I'm going to be shaking things up a bit this episode with a nightmare-inducing statue of the Witch from the Left 4 Dead series. I'm a huge fan of the Witch, not only because she has a pretty cool character design, but also because she changes up the pace in the game quite a bit, from shoot everything in sight to more of a stealth mode. So without any further ado, let's get to it. For this video, I'm going to be using a variety of materials ranging from cheap hangers to your basic paintbrush set. I'm going to be using some cheap apple barrel acrylics as well as some other stuff I got somewhere. I don't know. It's the cheap stuff from the store. Artist acrylics in tubes, an extender medium or thinning medium, some original Sculpey, as well as some Primo Sculpey. I don't have it in the original container. Some UV resin, a UV light, a couple of homemade clamps, and some various sculpting tools. And most importantly, my cup of coffee, which appears to be mostly empty already, and I haven't even started. So if you'd like to buy me a cup of coffee, link up in the corner right there. So I stop spending money on coffee and spend it on all this stuff. Links to everything you see here in the description below. So let's go get started making stuff. I'm gonna use the wire hangers for my armature to keep the budget low for this make. Special shout out to my local dry cleaners for donating hangers for this video. Once it's straightened out after sticking two ends into a homemade armature clamp, I'll bend and twist the opposite ends until I have something resembling the basic pose of our witch. I'll then murder a second hanger to reinforce her core so she's nice and stable once we add clay. Even before she has her claws, she's already slicing me up. Now I remember why I hate using hangers for armatures. It's important that she doesn't wiggle too much while I'm working the clay later, so I probably overdid the reinforcements just to make sure she's nice and stiff before making some final adjustments to her overall pose. Next, it's time to add some foil to bulk her out. This reduces the amount of clay that I have to use so I can save some moolah. For my clay, I'm mixing half white original Sculpey, which is cheap and soft and cracks easily, and half black Sculpey Primo, which is more expensive and about as malleable as a 2x4. Now let's see if I can do what all the other cool YouTubers do to mix their clay. I don't think that's how it's supposed to work. Maybe I can just smack it or something. Ah, yes, there we go. Look at me, I'm a pro YouTuber now. I'm gonna apply thin sheets of my new gray clay to the armature to start giving our witch her form. I use a cheap pasta machine to thin out the clay, but you can just roll it out manually if you don't have one. Once the armature's covered up, I'll start adding blobs of clay to build out her girlish figure, including a nice saggy gut and hips that truly don't lie. She's looking a bit thin at this point, so let's put a little more meat on her ribs as well as some canyons and folds all around to really bring out our witch's sexy, rotting flesh. I have a tendency to use my fingers quite a bit in my projects, whether I'm sculpting or painting or applying hot glue, the latter of which is problematic for reasons you can likely guess. I really prefer to use my fingers to smooth out clay surfaces especially, but I tried to edit this video to show me using tools instead, so I look like I actually know what I'm doing. Apparently I missed a few shots where I had my hands all over the sculpture, so just pretend like you didn't see that. After some belly button surgery, I'll give her some saggy 3-pack abs by adding some rolled strands of clay and then smoothing them out with my smaller silicone tool. This is where I really get to add definition to the witch's figure and pretend like I really know what an emaciated female body looks like, since I keep mine stocked with a couple decades of cookies and cake just in case I get lost in a desert for a week. Now, at this point, I realized that I made her ribcage too short, so I used a wood sculpting tool to reposition her ribs and hoo-has before continuing on her lovely 3-pack. Now, it's time to give her some shoulders in preparation for adding a couple of scrawny arms, which I'll do directly onto the wire. Now, if I were smart, I would have coated the wire with something so that the clay would stick better. But I decided I wanted to make this more of a challenge, so I'll have to deal with her arms rotating constantly as I work. I'll go ahead and give her a bit of a neck to give myself a break from my terrible decision to put clay directly onto wire hangers. While I'm there, I'll add a few more tiny strands of clay for her clavicle and those weird neck muscle things that run from the clavicle to the sides of her neck, and a little more definition with a variety of tools. Then it's back to the arms. Now I'll slice in the make it easier to wrap around the wire. A little smoothing here and there, a nice little elbow, and we have a basic arm. Now we replicate on the other side to give our witch a couple of eerie nubs. What's a rib cage without ribs? This might be the easiest part of the sculpture since it entails simply drawing on the ribs and then smoothing them out. Now, fingers and toes, on the other hand, are the bane of my existence, and I'm not even gonna tell you how many attempts this took me to get the feet right. But overall, I guess I'm okay with how they turned out. After sending a piece of clay through my pasta machine on the thinnest setting, I'll cut out some small strips that will indicate the edges of our witch's clothing. For the bottom edges, I'll rough it up a bit before adding it to the sculpture, just to end up tearing it even more once it's on with a pair of tweezers so that it has a nice, ripped up zombie outfit look. We'll then do the same thing on the back, starting with the shirt straps that we'll totally cover up later, and then the ripped edges along the bottom. Now to finish up the other strap on her, would you call this a shirt? Top? Whatever. We'll go ahead and give her some lovely matching undies. Now, there's a couple ways I like to add folds into clothing. The first is subtractive, where I just cut a fold into the clay. The second is additive, where we add a rolled strand of clay and smooth it with our silicone tool like before. The second method is definitely more versatile and lets you create some pretty cool drape effects. Alright, now to make our headless zombie not so headless. Same approach as before, beginning with a foil and wire armature, then adding clay. Making this witch's head reminded me how terrible I am at sculpting human heads, but you can judge that for yourself. If you'd like to know what the creepiest part of this entire process was, it has to be anything involving this horrific zombie mouth. And unfortunately, it just gets worse and worse until it finally kinda gets better. Next, we'll add some cheekbones and smooth those in just like we do everything else, and that's what really starts to give our witch her facial structure. Now, if you aren't terrified how horrible this looks now, just wait until I start giving her eyes. See what I mean? I told you it gets worse before it gets better. Finally, I'll start giving her facial features a bit more detail and expression, starting with the eyelids, and a concerned brow, and a shorter nose, and the most horrific mouth you have ever seen. Ew. This is the stuff of nightmares. Now, to finish off her nose with some cute little nostrils and more defined smile lines, or I guess moaning lines. And the head is ready to go on the body. Even though her prematurely bald head looks a bit big at first, it'll look a lot better once the neck is blended and she's got some hair. Just need to put her head into the right position, and we're ready to stick some floppy fins onto her scalp to make some hair. You'll notice I do this a couple of ways. I start by adding the clay and then adding the texture, which presents another safety hazard. So I decided after doing her right side, I'd add the texture to the hair on her left side first and then attach the hair in sheets. Either way, the hair comes out looking about the same. I did have to bulk out her head a little more where her ear would be so that her hair fell more naturally, then eventually made my way around her head to add the last few patches of hair one at a time before blending them in and adding just a little more texture. Now we need to prep her arms for hands. I'm waiting until last to make her hands because, well, I hate making hands. I'll start by giving her some properly shaped bony nubs, and then make a couple of tiny armatures from a thinner craft wire for her hands to attach to after she's been baked once, since attaching fingers to a soft sculpture sounds like a nightmare to me. Now I'll brush her down with a bit of isopropyl alcohol to smooth away any fingerprints or bumps from her skin and her hair, and this will create a super thin slurry layer on the surface that results in a really nice smooth finish after baking. While our witch enjoys a nice relaxing spa treatment in the oven, I'll make her terrifyingly long slashy fingertips by rolling some small pieces of clay to a point. After I've got 10 of them ready to go, I'll throw them on a baking sheet, give them a little bendy knuckle, and throw them in the oven. While they're baking, I'll add the palms of her hands to her baked nubs and start shaping where her thumb and knuckles should be. Finally, once the fingers are hardened, I'll poke some little holes into her palms and blend in her digits. Rinse, repeat for the remaining fingers and her right hand, then throw her in the oven one last time, and finally we have a witch statue ready for final touches. After digging through my craft containers, I found a dried blob of craft cement that I'd saved from a previous project and thought it'd make a nice simple base for our witch. After very safely drilling a couple of holes into the cement, I jammed the witch into her new base only to notice at the last minute that it wasn't quite long enough. So I bulked it up by adding a bit of Sculpey glue and clay, and then texturized it with a rock from the backyard. We're finally on to my favorite part, the painting. I'm starting by priming our witch in a dark purple mixed from various cheap acrylic paints, which will give us a nice undercoat that the rest of our colors can ride on. Once she's all primed up, I'll start adding some lighter shades of the same purple for her skin, followed up with a coat of mold green acrylic paint for her clothing. One more coat of light purple for her skin, and we're ready to add the darker shade to her extremities by mixing a little thinning medium with a darker shade of purple as well as with our lighter shade. That way the paint doesn't dry as quickly and we're able to blend the two colors together. I'll add the darker shade to her fingers as well, but this time I'll use more of a dry brushing technique since they're much more delicate. Next, we'll do a bit of dry brushing over her clothing with a lighter mold green. Dry brushing is always recommended since it really brings out the texture and peaks in three-dimensional pieces. For her hair, I'll start with a purplish black layer, followed by a brownish layer, and then a pinkish layer, and then finally a lighter pink on top. Using the tiniest brush I own, I'll also add some red into her eyes before finishing it off with some dry brushing on the base to bring out that nice rocky texture. The next step is to bring it all together with a wash, which is basically extremely watered down paint slopped all over the sculpture and then wiped off the surface before it has a chance to dry. This allows the darker color from the wash to settle into the crevices to make some nice shadows, as well as bring all the colors in the sculpture a little closer together so it looks more uniform and realistic. This time I'm using less expensive artist acrylics from a tube, since my cheap craft acrylics don't really make good washes. This is a really similar purple to the original prime coat, but with a bit more red this time. The wash settles especially nice into her hair, giving it a more dynamic look. Finally, we'll do a small amount of dry brushing to bring the highlights back out after applying the wash. And the final touch is a tiny amount of UV resin applied to her eye to make it appear glassy, as if she's been crying. And with that, our witch is complete. So there she is, scary as ever. Probably one of the creepiest things I think I've ever made in my life. If you'd like to see me make more creepy things, or if you have an idea for what I should make next, please leave a comment below. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. And if you haven't already, subscribe. If you have, thanks so much. Have a lovely day. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to see more, click one of these. It's pretty freaky.